大家好，欢迎您来听我谈。今天这期视频呢，是我于2024年的8月份录制的。当时呢，我正在准备我研究生音乐指挥专业的毕业典礼。这个指挥专业的毕业典礼呢，要求我自己找朋友组一支管乐团，自己编排一场完整的音乐会。所以当时我找到了我在本科期间读钢琴专业的时候结识的一位好朋友 Justin Lapierre。之后呢，他在多伦多大学读了音乐作曲专业的研究生。我真的觉得这个人有两把刷子，所以当时就找到他呢，希望能让他单独专门为我的毕业典礼写一首曲子来让我指挥。所以这次采访呢，就是在他在作曲的过程中，在我的毕业典礼之前采访他对于作曲以及对于做音乐人的一些大概的想法和感悟。我本人呢也非常喜欢这类人物采访系列的播客类的节目，所以呢，我之后也已经为大家录好了一期我采访我研究生期间的研究生导师的节目。剪完之后呢，尽快放给大家看，也希望大家能够多多点赞、评论、关注，参与讨论。感谢您的支持。
All right. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm sitting here with Justin Lapierre, the composer of the featured piece on my recital. Justin and I actually go quite a bit back when we went to Laurier together.
Yeah, Les Diaz.
That's right, Les Diaz's piano studio. But my first memory of Justin was in first year theory. And there were sections of the first year theory was dictation.
Oh my God.
Back then, we were required to dictate what the professor plays. And the requirement was to write down the bass line and write down the melody. And normal music students like us would take like a listening or two to write the things down, but not for Justin. Justin would take one listen of it, get all 4 parts, and then for the rest of the time, he would compose a fugue based on that melody dictation. So at the time, we were all like, who is this guy, right? So Justin, tell us about yourself.
I was really not humble when I was like younger. I remember that. I forgot about that until you brought it up, actually.
Yeah, but
to be perfectly honest.
How did you get there, that kind of musical training? That takes training, right? So what's your background?
Just kind of being able to like audiate music, which is totally separate from composition, I think. Okay. Like there's some really wonderful musicians who are brilliant, like they have perfect pitch, they can audiate music like amazingly, but then like composing, like they don't even want to go near it. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I do think composing helped me to do like that kind of like technique part.
Right.
Because I remember like just when you write music and you write it at the piano. I remember when I was like young, like I was like 13 or 14, and I just started like composing music. Oh. But you write music, you start writing kind of simple things, and then if there's like a pattern, you realize, oh, I know what that sounds like. I know what that sounds like, and then you just kind of piece it together until you kind of can like hear what you've written.
Right.
It's a very kind of gradual process.
Okay.
But yeah, I also had a composition teacher, Joanne Bender, who's in Waterloo. She was really, like some composition teachers are really, they want you to kind of explore and they want you to find out, you know, what sounds you like, what you can do with them. But Joanne is, I think, rightfully so, she wants you to have your technique first. Yeah. In a kind of, not like Nadia Boulanger, not that intense, but she definitely wants you, like the first thing we did was like, okay, like counterpoint.
Yeah.
Like you need to do your, you know, we had a book of like the 5 species counterpoint.
Right.
I wasn't even 16 yet, and I was doing like Fuchsian counterpoint, which was really good, I think. You know, and I think having gone to a composition teacher, instead of like I had a piano teacher, but I also had a composition teacher.
Interesting.
Which, yeah, I think I was lucky to have that, because then she's a very good composer, and she knows exactly what you need. Like what is like technique for a musician who performs versus someone who composes.
Right.
You know?
And that's your teenage years. And I
was lucky in that way, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm also curious, what kind of music did you listen to when you were a kid, and what kind of like family?
It's funny because when I was a kid, I didn't think I liked music.
Okay.
I didn't think I liked music,
Okay.
to be honest. I remember when I was super young, I had like a toy piano, and it had like preloaded like kind of like things on it. And I remember thinking like, oh, this is garbage. Like this, and it had just like basic kind of classical music
Right.
on it.
Right.
And I remember thinking like, oh, this like I didn't like, but I think I was just shy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what's the?
But it's weird. I don't know what made me like music. I have to ask you, because what made you like music?
I didn't really enjoy music. I started piano back in China when I was 4
When
years
did you?
old.
You were 4. Okay.
When I was 4
Me
years old,
too.
but yeah. So but I didn't really enjoy it. I was just learning piano like every other Chinese.
I didn't enjoy it either. Like until I reached a certain age,
Yeah.
and then you mature a little bit, and you realize that this is really
Yeah, and
something good.
and
But
yeah.
before that, you don't like it.
Yeah, and I really had to credit to my high school music teacher after I came to Canada when I was 15. My high school music teacher, she was just like, James, you can read music. Amazing. Go play mallet percussion. Come to the ensemble rehearsals. Play something. Play whatever you want, really. And then she really talked to me and explained to me and showed me that, yeah, music is more than just drilling Hanong exercises on the keyboard, on the 88 keys. And music is not just black and white keys on the piano, but there's so much more to it, and there's a collaboration, there's stuff. So I think so. It was a matter of...
It's really somebody in your life that
I think so.
gives
That's
you...
what happened to me,
Which, I
yeah.
mean, you're gassing me up, but James could sing the solfege of like a Chopin, like ornamental. I remember that in
Right.
Wes's studio.
Right.
You could sing like the chromatic solfege of all the notes, and not in like 30-second, like digga-digga-digga-digga, and you're
Yeah,
singing the solfege. Yeah.
I think that's by training. I think that's in Chinese rudimentary training. They emphasize on solfege syllables, and that's how.
It's actually really, it's a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I think that's quite European, if I'm not mistaken. And after Laurie, you came to University of Toronto.
But back to I remember that though,
Yeah.
you asking me, because especially when I first got to Laurier,
Mm-hmm.
I was really bad at learning music.
Interesting.
I was really bad at learning music.
You're just really good at writing them.
I mean, that's for you to say, I guess. But I mean, well, back then I wasn't that much better at writing than I was at learning music.
No,
But I remember Les gave me the,
Chopin.
no, I picked that actually.
Okay.
Because it was easy.
Right.
But he'd give me a Rachmaninoff, the easiest Rachmaninoff prelude. It's number 4,
All
the
right.
D major
Yeah.
one. And it
Yeah.
has these like long arpeggios.
Yeah.
And I worked on that, I think, all of the fall semester. That was the only piece I played, really.
Well, the
And I never really learned it.
But the reason why I say you're so good at writing is because I remember doing the concerto competition together.
Oh my god, that
And
was so bad.
You
Both times I did it, it was bad.
It's
It was bad.
But I've not met another person in
Well,
my
thank
life
you.
at least.
Thank
that
you, first of all. That's really...
So you wrote your own piano concerto and you competed with it.
Well, I did. I don't advertise that piece anymore because it's... So the first concerto competition I did, I played the Bach D minor.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was... Oh my god, I screwed that up so bad. I made it to the second round, but the second round I messed it up royally. Like it was really bad. And then the second year, I did write my own concerto.
Yeah.
But I hadn't... It was the first time I wrote a piece that was longer than like 10 minutes.
Right.
You
It
know?
was multiple movements.
But I
It
think
was-
it's kind of a good thing I did that because when I started writing pieces for Ben, because writing a piece that's long, you have, well, any piece really, but it comes out especially when you write things that are long. You have to think about the overarching,
Yeah.
like,
The longer
narrative, the journey. Well,
yeah.
the journey. Like,
Yeah.
how does it unfold over time? Why is this piece 20 minutes long?
Right.
Like, I mean,
What's going on,
because you
yeah.
asked me to write it, make it 20 minutes long, so
Yeah.
it fits your recital requirements.
Yeah.
Great. But at the same time, it's like, it needs to also have a reason for being,
That's right.
And
Yeah.
it's not just like a bunch of ideas that you had and you just like alphabetize them and put them in a row and just, and there's a piece.
Right.
It has to kind of unfold. So that piano concerto I wrote, I didn't understand that yet. And it's confusing too when you're young because you don't understand like that you have to be rewarded
Right.
at the end. Like even though like
you have to
Rachmaninoff
get somewhere.
piano concertos are so like it feels like there's a tempo change every like 20 bars, but there's a certain
chord changed.
yeah, but there's a certain like emotional logic
Yeah.
to it.
There's a line
you
to
know?
it. Yeah.
Like the second piano concerto, it's like it changes all the time.
Yeah.
And the third movement has really nothing to do with the first movement. And the second movement is like it's a
Together.
It's a masterpiece of like emotional
Right.
dramaturgy.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that, and that's like the highest level. Like where you're not even relying on like there are themes that come back.
Right.
But there's something rhapsodic about it, and
Yeah.
yet it's a cohesive whole.
It's cohesive. That's right.
And that's like masterful. But when you're young, you don't realize the distance between like that and like what you're doing. So you just think that as long as the music, you know, the music is kind of like in a vacuum.
Right.
You know, this idea exists in a vacuum. It doesn't exist as part of this whole like kind of world that you're making.
Right.
So that piano concerto, I just first and the orchestra. Don't even get me started. But the orchestration of it was, I didn't understand like, you know, blending colors and the harmonic series and that type of thing.
Right. But
so
we're talking about this is when you were in second year undergrad.
Yeah, and I did.
Right.
I remember writing it. I started at the beginning. At first, you're like excited, so you write. It's really easy, and then you hit the middle, and then you start to get like discouraged, and you can only write like 2 bars a day.
Right.
The reason for that being is that there's no kind of thesis
Right.
for the whole thing.
Right.
You know, like
I can sort of get
like
that, yeah.
timestamp like 17 minutes, and you're like deep in the piece. What does that have to do with the thesis of the whole thing?
Interesting, yeah.
Right? And that's why, you know, if you run into that kind of wall, that writer's block, not that all writer's block is caused by this, but if you're writing this massive kind of thing and then you run into a wall in the middle, the reason is because there wasn't a kind of purity of purpose for the whole thing. You know what I mean?
Well put, very well put.
I find.
I do have
Yeah.
one comment for that is, you know, how many undergrad music students get to come back years later and diss their own orchestration of their own piano concerto
I think
that
you
they
should.
wrote in undergrad.
I think you should. You should
that-
always diss yourself.
Just that journey, be able to do that, I think is fascinating. And so some of these concepts you must have gotten while you were in your grad school, when you were doing your grad
Yeah,
school
well,
here
a lot
in
of like
U of T.
that. It's just a matter of having done it, and then once you do it, you look back and you're like, you realize what you should have done, which is the best way to learn, actually. You know, the few times that I've taught, I know you want to talk about teaching, but the few times that I've taught students, and especially when you get around to teaching them like harmony and counterpoint and stuff like that, and there's so many, like if you can't give them a textbook and it's like all the rules, you have to learn by mistake. That I've always found to be the most effective way to teach someone how to write like 4-part harmony is because, you know, if you learn an instrument, you know, or like piano especially, you understand like chords and like roots and things.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, go write like a 4-part chorale, and there's full of parallel fifths and octaves, and it's just there's no inversions at all, and it's nonsensical. But then you tell them, oh, okay, well, see, you've done, because in their mind, that's the best they could do at that point.
Right.
And then if you say, okay, well, see, you have parallel fifths there, and that's bad because of this, they'll never do them again.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, they realize.
You know, and actually, sorry, just going back, I just realized when we were talking about like counterpoint and my composition teacher, when I was in high school, right? I went to a very non-musical high school. I went to a French high school. There's no resources. My music class in high school was so small. There was 3 people. There was a minimum of 4 people to have a class exist. So my friend every year would enroll and then drop out so we could have a music class. That's a true story.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But anyway, there was no, you know, our music teacher wasn't a music teacher. He was a math teacher who didn't even want to teach music.
Right.
But he did.
Yeah.
And we had no band, no choir, no nothing. So eventually I actually got together some of my friends who I knew like sung in their free time and they couldn't read music or anything, but I literally just gathered them, like a dozen girls. Guys didn't sing, you know, this is where we're at.
High school, yeah.
Yeah, so, but it was like a dozen girls, and I just taught them to sing, like, you know, sing something different than the person next to you, just basic, because they can't read music.
Right.
They couldn't read, no one could sight sing.
Yeah, it takes training and takes practice, yeah.
And I went to a Catholic school, so we had like mass. The school often wanted us to like sing at the mass, because they would literally just put on like a YouTube video of like, It was really like
something.
Yeah. So anyway, so I would like teach them. I have a book of like just little, and there's no French like hymn book. Like some churches have like hymn books.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But the French Catholic community in Ontario doesn't really have a
Very specific.
Yeah. So I would just write, and also if there was, it's too difficult to teach by rote.
To read,
so it was just easier literally to write like things that they could sing in like 2-part harmony.
Right.
You know, that just they could sing with like 4 notes in one part and 4 notes in another part.
Yeah.
And they would always start on like the tonic and like go in contrary motion.
Right.
Just very simple.
Yeah.
But in doing that, that was a very good exercise in counterpoint. Because then one day I wrote like parallel fifths. I did, and then I realized I was like, oh, that sounds bad.
Right.
I didn't know why, but it sounded bad. Okay, I won't do that ever again.
Right.
And that was also a good, and that's why the few times I did teach students like 4-part harmony, I always made them learn by error.
Right.
Because that is just, because then you never do that again.
That's right.
It's,
That's amazing.
if you learn a rule, it goes to like a different part of the brain.
And something amazing about that is also getting people involved. And you said these singers, they didn't really read music at all.
No.
But you actually engaging more people and have music in more people's lives, right? So
Oh, yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
very important, and the choir is a fantastic tool for that. I think people don't necessarily have to be able to read big, masterful pieces, but we can still involve them to whatever capacity they want.
You don't have to write necessarily like traditional notation
Right.
all the time. Well, I mean, it depends on the context. If you're writing something for like Toronto Mendelssohn Choir, like like open Sibelius and write in Sibelius. But like for what, I just described, I literally would write kind of like a neum, like, like
Sort of directions and
yeah. I took like music paper and I would just kind of write like
Go
the
up, go
directions.
down, yeah.
Yeah, and that's just as kind of like a reminder.
Right.
Which is literally what neumes are.
So,
But I actually did that for them. That was their music that they like read from.
so maybe that also has to do with now that you're in Teachers College at Ottawa.
Yeah.
So what?
And as a big part of that is how do you teach people to sing as a choir with no notation, nothing.
Right, fascinating.
Like totally by memory. And it's amazing how you can actually like teach a whole group of people to sing an actual piece.
Right.
With no, I mean, it can't just be any piece. Like, it can't just be like Carmina Burana.
Yeah,
like,
Beethoven 9. Let's do it.
No, yeah. Just people who don't know music, but who are enthusiastic about music.
Yeah, they want to enjoy it.
There are actually a lot of ways to have them sing a whole concert from memory.
Also, on that note, now you're in education, and remember we had a conversation about
Yeah.
why now you had your master's in composition from University of Toronto.
Yeah.
Quite impressive. And then you're going
you.
into Teachers College. Where's the connection there? What's the inspiration there for?
When I was going into music, I think every music student has that moment where they're like, okay, why am I doing this?
Right.
And if you're a performer, I think
what's going on here?
I mean, it's not easy, but at least the vision, I mean, I'm going to play in an orchestra.
Right.
Or if, maybe I'll be a soloist if you're really like the crème de la crème,
Yeah.
That's great. But when you're a composition student, it's like and a composition student might go off and, I guess, get their DMA and work at university and that. But aside from the fact that, I mean, there's not
Where do you
as
go?
many tenure track positions as there were.
Right.
I'm actually a passionate teacher. Like I always kind of wanted to teach. The master's was kind of just incidental. I never planned on getting my master's in composition. That was just because, well, I was always kind of, I'm going to do education in my undergrad and go to teachers college and become a teacher. That was what I wanted to do before I even went to Laurier. Because I told you my music class had no music teacher. So I was like, well, I'll come back and be a music teacher. I would love that.
That's amazing.
That was kind of the starting point of that. But composition, I've always wondered why do I have this passion for composition and teaching?
Yeah.
And I didn't really have an answer until, actually, I did pull this up before, so ready for just this moment right here. My master's advisor, Christos Hatsis, he wrote in his book, because he's also a passionate teacher, right? Which he's also a great composer, so that just goes to show.
Yeah.
But I remember reading his book, one of his books that he has on his website, hatsis.com. A shameless plug for him. You're welcome. And he wrote, I read this and I was like, that's why. And this is it. If you can reach people at such a depth and make a difference in their creative lives, then this reaching out is very similar to the reaching in that an active composer engages with. In this important sense, composing and teaching composition become one and the same. And I feel very grateful to have been given the opportunity to do both as a vocation, he writes.
That's beautiful.
It's true, because you have to reach into somebody, whether you're a teacher or a composer.
Right.
You know, I mean, obviously it depends on the music you write. Some people, like, who cares if you listen? That's the opposite of reaching in. But generally, I mean, when you're creating music, when you're writing a piece, that emotional arc I was talking about, it's very much like teaching the audience or the listener,
right.
I should say, you're teaching them something.
Right, you have to convince
them. It doesn't have to be explicit, but something in themselves, or at least you try to.
Right.
You know?
We should aim for, we should strive for that, to just reach for something to convince them that this is a good idea. Listen
well, right.
To this and then
you know, it's like when people clap at the end of a performance, it should be to say thank you for letting something enter into our lives that wasn't there before. Everybody claps after a performance, but if you can make that become like a thank you, I think that is the ultimate goal. As a musician,
right?
You know.
So with that goal in mind, Negative Entropy Symphony.
the title, or the piece itself.
Both.
The title. Well, actually, the title comes from Christos Hatsis, who I just read. He's very much into like quantum physics, and he's very fascinated by.
Of course.
So a lot of my lessons would kind of turn into like these kind of really deep conversations about, and he knows like all these like quantum physicists. Back when he was in his PhD, he was roommates with the guy who like first described fractals. He was roommates with him. So ever since then, he was really like, he calls fugues musical fractals, but he would talk about entropy and how, you know, music is kind of the opposite of what you would expect in reality. Because in reality, thermodynamics, entropy, it's the inevitable state of all things. Like, it's just everything decays.
Yeah.
But negative entropy is music, because entropy, things fall from order to chaos. And when you're a composer, you take chaos and you create order.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
And it's negative entropy.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't do it justice. He did explain it in one of his seminars. He explained negative entropy.
Right.
Anyway, but ever since then, that's how I've thought of music.
Okay.
You know, because you're taking chaos and you're creating order. You know, and it actually became. We were doing a project as a studio. He got a commission from a guy named Milkov, who's like the world's best marimba player. Like, he's a Yamaha artist. And he actually just finished a really big piece for him, like last month, for like 3 marimbas. But anyway, he got a commission. He wrote him a marimba concerto the year before, and now he got another commission to write an anthology of marimba pieces for this new technique that he had developed for the marimba, where you could basically play it like a piano.
Okay.
So he was playing Scarlatti sonatas on the marimba. So he wanted an anthology that was Scarlatti-like,
right,
but of new music.
Okay.
But Christos actually did it as a studio project instead of just his own music. So we each wrote a piece of this anthology. Yeah, and I wrote a piece called Negative Entropy, which is actually the last movement.
Okay, interesting.
I orchestrated it. But the reason it's Negative Entropy, because what he wanted you to do was take a Scarlatti sonata and create what he calls a palimpsest of it with your own music on top of it. Which, I mean, from my piece in the summer, like 1,000 Shields of Gold, the third movement is a palimpsest of Mahler's Adagietto. Like, you're hearing both musics at once.
Yeah.
It's not like a medley. A medley is a more kind of like cut and paste.
Yeah.
But it's like baked into the piece.
Yeah.
You know? So
there's something you're basing on something.
Yeah,
else
exactly. And he wanted us to do this
there.
with the Scarlatti sonata and our own music and create a marimba piece.
Right.
That was being, you know, that showcased the new piano techniques. He had to like do all these things. And I actually didn't really do the piano technique part all that well. I did, because I I don't think I truly understood it. So it was more kind of traditional marimba technique, which I don't think he really appreciated. I don't think so, but I think that the piece itself, musically, I was really proud of it.
Right.
But what I did, I actually, instead of doing my, a palimpsest between my own music and Scarlatti, I did a palimpsest the other way between Scarlatti and Guillaume de Machaut. Like the Messe de Notre Dame, right? So I took parts of the Messe de Notre Dame, and the Scarlatti Sonata that I actually played with Les at Laurier, because there's these they're both based on this very similar like motif. This this very simple, but that motif is a central part of both compositions. So I took those two and I made so that was negative entropy, because you're actually going the other way in time.
Right.
You're going from Scarlatti, and then it turns into Machaut at the end. It turns into the last movement of the Messe. Like in the last movement of the symphony, there's like a brass chorale. And that's the introduction of the last movement of the Machaut. So anyway, but I turned that into, I orchestrated that because there's so many lines in it. Like the whole piece is just kind of like pointillistic. I hope rehearsals go well, because it's just, I was making parts and I was like, oh my God, like I can't, you don't need any cues because you're always playing. But it's like there's so many rests, and I hope
it has
counting.
To line in.
But if it works, which I hope it works, but it'll be like a pointillistic type of texture with all these different, like each note is part of like a horizontal like strand, basically.
I can absolutely see that, and I think that also translates to most of your compositions, is that there are elements of things. And I was talking to one of the players that played 1,000 Years Ago this summer, and they said, looking at my part, it looks chaotic, but when we started rehearsing it, it makes so much sense. So I think that very well speaks for your compositional style and actually how to make it make sense, right? But also talking about the first movement and second movement and the third movement that you're still working on.
I'm working on the third movement right now.
The first movement, tell us
so the first movement, let me start with, so what we were talking about writing a long piece, right? You need a thesis, right? No matter how, it doesn't matter what it is, but it just has to have like one, it doesn't have to be even like a thing. It can just be like a concept or just a feeling or you get better at it the more you do it, I feel, which is why people like Rachmaninoff should create these large structures, you know? But when you asked me to write this 20-minute piece, and the first place I go to is like, okay, the first performance, like where is it gonna be? Who's gonna be playing it? Who's gonna be listening to it? Yeah, it'll be performed maybe again in the future, who knows? But the first performance where, that's where you look back to when you do a piece, like a second performance or a third performance, the performers always want to know about the premiere. Because the premiere is just so special. So I always look to that. And because it's your grad recital at the University of Toronto, where, I did. So I was like, okay, well, this piece is kind of like a debrief or like a meditation on, my time in Toronto. When I was living here and I was working here and I was in school.
And you graduated during COVID.
And during COVID.
So this is sort of like your grad recital. Can we put it that way? Is that sort of?
I mean, you don't get a master's grad recital in composition.
I suppose.
But it is a kind of like I'm like meditation on all my work that I did in Toronto when I was here as a composer. What I learned, if I look at myself before and after, I mean, that was the most drastic change in my whole life, really. I was a very different composer when I started versus when I when I
Finished,
finished.
yeah.
Yeah. So the first movement, the title is Ockeghem and Pierre Boulez take the 501 Queen.
Yeah.
And again, that's
So-
an image, right? Right there. And it's not just like happenstance. Those are very specific because,
Yeah.
and everything comes in the story, right? So when I was doing my master's thesis,
Mm-hmm.
every week I would email what I had done for that week to Christos.
Uh-huh.
So I sent him my thesis, which is a very kind of dense academic, like serial composition, as I thought it should be.
course.
And at the same time, I was writing my Stabat Mater, which premiered 2 years ago.
Yeah. With
Also
Ben
conducted by
Wallace.
Ben.
Yep.
Yeah. And I was writing them at the same time. And it's very different, like, strains of thought. Like, the Stabat Mater is very modal, and it's very tuneful,
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, and this, my thesis is very, like, I had to give a presentation about it. So it was, you know, it's a very serious,
Yeah.
serious, but, like, theoretical thinking. You're more of a theorist
Yeah.
than a composer when you're
Yeah.
writing like that.
Right. You're
Anyway,
a
but-
scholar, you're a theorist, you're a...
Yeah, which I
it's-
think you should be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
But you're especially thinking that way when
Right.
you're writing that kind of music, which I don't ever write. But anyway, I've emailed it to Christos, and the email is important because I guess the attachments, I don't know if the way I named them or whatever, but he thought that they were two movements of the same piece. Right? So you have this like serial composition, and then this like kind of like modal, there's a kind of medieval, you know,
Yes.
yeah, about the Stabat Mater that I wrote.
Yeah.
So, but he thought it was the same piece. So anyway, I get to my lesson, and he was like, "Oh my God, that's just so brilliant!" Like that's, and I was like, "Oh my God, thank you." What are you? then
What's
I-
so brilliant?
yeah, and then he started talking about it, and I realized that he thought that they were the same. He thought that like one movement was like really dense and dry,
Uh-huh.
like theoretical, and the other movement was very kind of not that. So, and then but then he's like, "Oh well, you should. I think that should be your thesis."
Okay.
Like, you know, and I actually ended up putting that movement as the last movement of my thesis because
Okay.
of that, and because he said, you know, because it kind of explains how Pierre Boulez is the Ockeghem of our time, because they're both
Okay.
miniaturists.
Uh-huh.
And over time, like that pattern of, you know, you start, like, Ockeghem's music is very, you have one, like, thing,
Yeah.
and then you just sing that thing in different prolations, time signatures,
Right.
in different tempi, over top of one another, and it just unfolds into this prolation canon of, like,
Right.
six voices
Yeah.
out of this one cell. But that cell has been so mathematically like engineered, and this was like in the
interesting. I didn't know
14th
that, yeah.
century.
Right.
Yeah, and Pierre Boulez, I mean, his music is equally as mathematical.
Engineered. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what he was getting at, and he calls it that's their miniaturism,
Right.
is what he said.
Right.
And so anyway, I did that as part of my thesis,
Mm-hmm.
but I only inserted that movement from my Stabat Mater. I put a different text and I made it more integrated, but not as integrated as I would have liked. So actually the first movement of negative entropy
Mm-hmm.
is kind of doing that, but more in a refined, intentional way, as opposed to just kind of doing it because my teacher said so.
Right.
You know? Yeah. So the whole and then the whole 501 Queen, because if this piece is about Toronto,
Yeah.
Toronto is so diverse. Every part of Toronto has its own kind of flavor.
Yeah.
And the Queen streetcar, which everyone is for better or for worse had to take.
Yeah.
You know, it's just such like we don't realize it, but when people come here who are not from here, and they're amazed by the diversity of
Yeah.
just
the
going
city.
on this one streetcar
That's
through
right.
all these different neighborhoods. But Queen Street is also, you know, we're all like the broadcasting, all the performing
Yeah.
arts,
Yeah.
you know, that's kind of like Canada's hub a little
Yeah.
bit for like TV, music, radio.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that like, you know, here in this building where we're in, like the Faculty of Music, we kind of obsess like Ockeghem or Pierre Boulez, like this about theoretical and the, you know,
I see what you're
serial.
going with this. Yeah.
And then just over there is
And
you
down the
have
street,
like, you know, you have like pop culture.
Everything. Yeah.
And this contrast, how do you
Yeah.
deal with that contrast as a music student, as a composer in the 21st century? You know, why are we obsessing about, you know, tone rows and things when, you know, like Taylor Swift is going to do a concert? Why are we doing, I know we're part of this like very rich tradition of classical European music, but what's the relevance of that today?
Right.
It was relevant.
Right.
It was very relevant, even up until like 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I think, but our culture has just so much changed, for the better. But where are we now?
Where's music?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All these obsessions, this miniaturism, it's not a bad thing. It's just a matter of finding where does it fit in.
Right.
And I'll go back to my teacher, like Christos. He wrote Constantinople, which is really it's a meditation on Toronto.
Okay.
And it's about how Constantinople is a eutopos, so it's between East and West.
Yeah.
It's where they meet.
Yeah.
How does it work? And there's a mezzo-soprano and there's an Arabic vocalist with piano trio
and
electronics. But it's not like a direct piece, but just through like music alone, it kind of reconciles those two.
Yeah.
That same question of like where do we fit in as composers in the 21st century?
And as musicians overall, I think.
Yeah, well, of course, yeah. But that's kind of what that title represents.
Okay.
It's Akigem and Pierre Boulez take the 501 Queen.
Amazing.
And of course, there's just references to like I told you there's like a John Adams kind of groove about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can hear it.
Like the middle section is fully 12 tone.
Yeah.
So it's literally like there's like a modal section and like 12 tone.
Yeah. But
how do you mix those two? That's kind of.
And I mean, on that note, then I'm not sure if it's a compliment or not a compliment. But how could you make 12 tones sound so approachable? I guess that's
what the thing about 12 tone music is we think like 12 tone music it's so gross but
experimental.
Yeah, but we're so surprisingly used to it. Chromatic music, like hyperchromatic music.
Yeah.
It's not as alien as we're like so used to like reacting to it. Because one of my teachers, my previous teachers when I was at Laurier, Linda Smith, she said this great thing about like kind of style and genre is like you should only use what you need to use.
Yeah.
So like I wouldn't say I'm a 12-tone composer because there's a section of 12-tone music in my piece.
Right.
But in that instance, that was necessary for the grand thesis that I'm trying to. So
that was part of the journey.
A lot about it is like gesture is very big in my music. Also like everything should be part of like kind of a large, whether it's like that overarching thesis is like the large gesture, and then if there's like arcs in between that and inside that. I mean, thank you for complimenting my 12-tone composition. Not a lot of composers are complimented for their 12-tone music.
Yeah.
Like, thank you. But I think as long as it's part of a gesture and there's intention behind it, it doesn't matter what it is.
Right.
But it will make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. I mean, when I first presented this idea to my professor here, Gillian McKay, she was more concerned with, this is going to be, are you sure this is a good idea to get Justin to write?
Thank you for vouching for me.
But I said, like, no, this guy has something going on. Let's just see it. So after you sent me the first draft, and we looked at it together, and Gillian was like, yeah, this makes sense. It's not, it's playable. It's very playable, looking at the range and the technique required. It's not looking at each individual parts. Yes, counting might look a little chaotic, but we're quite certain that once we go into rehearsal, that exactly like, I was talking to Taryn, and Taryn said that each part looks so chaotic, but when you put it together, it makes so much sense. So and your composition, the puzzle just fits together.
Oh, thank you. I mean,
it's just
like about technique and all that, that's also a big thing that I think defined like before I started my master's and like after, is before I was really worried about like the technical, and, like the playability, which you should be, especially, but when you're younger, you should, like don't write notes that they can't play, obviously.
Yeah.
But once you kind of develop your own voice and you write for really good musicians, you start to realize that the playability will come if the composition has the intent behind it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I was watching an interview of like John Adams, I forget who it was, I think it was with the Berlin Phil, actually. But he was talking about his like harmonielehrer.
Okay.
And he was saying how
I remember that
the
video, yeah.
the orchestra who premiered it almost unprogrammed it because it was so technically challenging.
Yeah, I mean,
and
that's not-
yet, these days, there are high school orchestras that play it.
Yeah, and I mean,
So over time, like musicians get better, coupled with if your composition has intent,
yeah, they'll
that-
figure it out.
they'll figure it out. But also just like that's how like music will manifest itself,
Yeah, that's what I was
as long as you live within reason, of course. But
yeah.
you know, like if it can't be out of a concern for kind of playability and technique, that has to always be in the background, obviously.
Yeah.
But it should first and foremost come from intent. Oh, closer to home, like I don't know if you know Claude Vivier.
Yeah.
He was
Okay.
the head of the composition department at the University of Ottawa.
Okay.
But he studied with Stockhausen, and he lived in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
But he wrote, or he was commissioned by the NYO
Okay.
to write a piece called Siddhartha,
Uh-huh.
and it was too difficult for them. But now it's hailed as being like this masterpiece of Canadian music.
Right.
Yeah, it's difficult, but eventually like it will be an expressive tool for the performers. That's the job of a composer.
Right.
Again, Linda Smith at Laurier, she used to tell me the biggest problem about being a composer is that anything you write on the page will be okay. Really?
Yes.
You
A
know.
lot of responsibility there, right?
Well,
It's like-
you really have to kind of check yourself because you can, and I won't say who, but I studied with a very good composer who told me, and they received this great commission for a really well-known ensemble, and they wrote a piece for this ensemble. But because of what was going on in their life, and just one thing came after another, and they were running out of time, that they were only proud of 60% of the composition. That's just the reality.
Right.
You know, and that is the biggest problem, is that anything you write as a composer will be okay. So it's really, and it's unlike any other kind of activity or where you have to really kind of check yourself and be honest.
Right.
We talk about like academic honesty at school,
Yeah.
but what about like artistic honesty? You can't check that,
That's true. That's true.
you know?
But it's personal.
It's personal.
But it has to be there.
And you can get away with not being artistically honest,
That's right.
but I
And
don't recommend it.
And the industry won't get away with not being artistically honest.
I
right?
think in the long term, especially, like writing dishonestly or
we're performing dishonestly.
surface, or performing especially. Yeah, I always tell people how I remember seeing Brahms at the KW Symphony back when the KW Symphony existed.
Yeah.
It was the Dvorak cello concerto.
Okay.
And it was just the soloist was so expressive to the point that it was like distracting,
Okay.
you know?
Interesting.
And I remember talking to Les
Okay.
about it.
Not serving
Because we had to do
music
concert
anymore.
reports,
Yeah.
remember?
Yeah, I remember.
Remember that? But I remember talking about it, but the soloist, he was like overly expressive, like it was distracting. And he was talking about how, well, you know, like some soloists have gimmicks.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it makes them unique, so it's kind of like a marketing thing. But he asked me, he's like, oh, well, what do you think Hilary Hahn's gimmick is? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, her gimmick is that she's a great violinist.
Okay.
And that really stuck with me. I think quality and artistic honesty, it really does, we have a sense for it that it's easy to underestimate.
Right.
So I think out in the real world, being honest artistically, or not being honest artistically will come out,
Right.
and people will know.
Right.
Will know that. But I think now more than ever that it is really important, and it's really hard because making something from nothing, whether you're writing music or you're a new interpretation of music,
Playing music,
is so incredibly difficult. Music, whether you're writing it, performing it, even listening to it with intent and appreciating it with like every bone of your body, it just comes from your own knowledge of
And
being
experience.
human.
Yeah.
That you can't like really learn from a book or even from a teacher. You have to really live inside of it and let it just grow with time.
Right.